Hi, welcome to this lesson on introducing and citing textual evidence. What is textual evidence? That's a good question. Textual evidence is evidence that you take from the story, article, or book that you're reading. The more pertinent the textual evidence, the stronger your claim will be. So why do we use textual evidence? We use textual evidence because it provides support for our claim. When you're unsure of an answer, finding pertinent textual evidence can also help you find the correct answer. So how do we actually introduce textual evidence into our writing? It's always a good idea to introduce the reader to the name of the story and to the author. So here's an example from The Lady or the Tiger. And you can see how I've written it out. In The Lady or the Tiger, comma, author Frank R. Stockton writes, comma. So notice the features here. We've got quotation marks, commas, capitalization, and we'll get into more detail on that right now. Another way to introduce textual evidence is to say, in the short story, The Lady or the Tiger, author Frank R. Stockton writes. So you can see that's just two different ways, or two different common ways in which we can introduce text. So in The Lady or the Tiger, author Frank R. Stockton writes, and in the short story, The Lady or the Tiger, Frank R. Stockton writes. So you can see they're actually very, very similar. So I'm just going to take one of our introductions and we'll just tear it apart a little bit. So here we go. Again, we have in The Lady or the Tiger, Frank R. Stockton writes. All right. First thing I want to point out is the comma usage. So you can see here that the commas have been highlighted. Those commas must be in place. So if you need to come back to this video to compare my introduction to your introduction, do so. Make sure you have the commas where they need to go. So you can see there is one after the title of the story, and then another at the end of our introduction after writes. And the reason we have that is because commas are used to separate information. In this case, we're separating the title from the author and making the sentence more clear to the reader. Without commas, the words would all run together. It would sound like, in The Lady or the Tiger, author Frank R. Stockton writes, which doesn't sound as clear as, in The Lady or the Tiger, Frank R. Stockton writes. So you should be saying your sentences out loud as you're writing. It'll help you hear where commas need to go. Also note that the comma goes inside the quotation mark, as you can see right here. The next thing we need to talk about is the use of quotation marks. For a short story or an article, you will always use quotation marks. Notice that I haven't done anything else with the name of the text, and neither should you. Just use quotation marks. The next thing we're going to talk about is capitalization. You must capitalize the first word of a title. In this case, the. Sticking with capitalization, another rule is that we must also capitalize all of the essential words, like lady and tiger. Notice that we left or and the uncapitalized. Additionally, we need to capitalize names. Frank R. Stockton. Make sure that you're capitalizing each of the letters at the beginning of each of the names. If you have an initial, capitalize just the initial. Names must always be capitalized. So if you follow those rules, you should be in a pretty good spot. But I do want to take a moment to address some common problems that we see when students write their introductions to the textual evidence. So they may write something like, in The Lady or the Tiger by Frank R. Stockton writes. Now, that might sound weird when I read it. Let me say it again. In The Lady or the Tiger by Frank R. Stockton writes. Now, what you're trying to say here is that in the story The Lady or the Tiger, Frank R. Stockton has written something. but that's not actually what you're saying. Because we've separated by Frank R. Stockton and used the word by, you'll notice this creates kind of an awkward, fragmented sentence. And so this is technically not correct. All right? Like I said, by Frank R. Stockton, we actually don't need that information. That's extra information. It does provide clarity to the reader. We do want you to say the author's name, but the way this sentence is structured, you should be able to take it out and have your sentence still make sense. So if we take out the author, it would say, in the lady or the tiger writes. Now, that doesn't make sense either, because the lady or the tiger is a book title. It can't write anything. The author is the one who writes. So that's not correct either. Here's the simple fix. In the lady or the tiger, Frank R. Stockton writes, and you can hear that's much more natural. In the lady or the tiger, Frank R. Stockton writes. So you notice we've accomplished this by just removing by and this comma. So when you're introducing your textual evidence, read your sentences out loud to yourself. Make sure that it sounds complete. Make sure that it will make sense to the reader. Now we're going to get into the actual textual evidence. So this is a piece of textual evidence I've taken from the lady or the tiger. It said, often had she seen, or imagined she had seen, this fair creature throwing glances of admiration upon the person of her lover. Great. I think that's a decent piece of textual evidence, but we need to do some things with it. So here we have our introduction, which says, in The Lady or the Tiger, author Frank R. Stockton writes, and then I've got my textual evidence. So we need to combine these two. And so I've put them together, and you can see that when I put textual evidence in my writing, if I'm taking it, and you should take it directly from the text the way it is written, you have to put quotation marks around it. If you don't use these quotation marks, you haven't properly cited it, and that can be considered plagiarism. So make sure that you're putting the textual evidence in quotation marks. The next thing we have to do is cite the page number that we found it on, the textual evidence on. So in the edition I took this textual evidence from, it was on page 284. Now you'll notice something weird. The period has gone missing, and we've moved it to the outside. So we have the period, and then we move the period to the outside of our citation. The reason we do that is because this follows MLA guidelines. That's what we use for writing academic papers in English. When you look at the way it's cited with the period at the end, the reader knows, all right, this is the end of this sentence. It just adds some clarity for the reader, moving that period to the outside. You absolutely must do this. One other thing I want you to note, a lot of students feel like it's important to list the paragraph that they found it in, the paragraph number. You don't actually have to do that. In fact, don't do it. We don't want the paragraph number. All we are concerned with is the page number. So if you have been taught to say which paragraph you found it in, or write paragraph in your citation, forget all of that. All you simply have to do is put the page number. And notice that I haven't put page, I haven't written PG. All it is the number, and that's it. Now, one other change that I don't have here is, if I didn't mention the author up above, I would simply put I would simply put their last name right here before the page number, and I would just write Stockton, and then space, and then 284. So this is the finished product in The Lady or the Tiger. Author Frank R. Stockton writes, often had she seen, or imagined she had seen, this fair creature throwing glances of admiration upon her lover. This is how your textual evidence should look when you write it in your paper. So go forth. Go check your own writing and look to see, have you properly introduced and cited your textual evidence? Good luck.